So, good afternoon, everybody. We have made a little change in the program. We have now the talk from Henny Blomme. Henny Blomme has made his master in KU-Louvain, and also University of Köln. His PhD was in Paris 4, Sorbonne, and also some part in the University of Wuppertal. His talk has the title, A Kantian System of Modern Conceptions of Space. So I give the word to Henny.
Thanks a lot, Joel, for the organization together with Milena and for the invitation. So I'm very happy to be here, and I have to apologize that I will speak in English. My Portuguese is not good enough. I can understand it slightly, but to speak I wouldn't dare to put that burden on you. So my talk is about, it's some kind of systematic approach in Kant interpretation. I think that the systematic elements in Kant are very clear and have been stressed by a lot of scholars. Sometimes it has been seen as a negative aspect of Kant's thought, so that Kant wants to put everything in certain schemes ordered by the table of categories, and instead of taking this as a negative characteristic of Kant's philosophy, I tend to see it as a positive characteristic. And I think that, well, in most cases that I investigated on, I found, well, it's of course a personal view, but I found that Kant had good reasons to cling to his systematic divisions. I will just start, and you will see what I mean with systematic. Kant's transcendental aesthetics offers a solution to the somewhat sterile debate on space that was going on in the correspondence between Leibniz and Clarke. So Kant's solution neutralizes, so to say, an unsuccessful antagonism between Leibnizian and Newtonian conceptions of space by offering a third alternative in which the opponents should be able to find each other. But typically, Kant also framed these respective positions in a way that allowed him to label them with distinctive metaphysical options. It worked just before, but with the arrows.
Yes.
Mas está congelado a tela, tem que reiniciar. Onde é que está o PowerPoint? I will restart because it's
Freezing.
freezing.
Can you just stop it? You can continue as you want.
Well, the first slide is coming quite soon, but let's say I can fill time by talking a little bit. What I'm saying in this introduction is that Kant had a way to frame the positions of Newton and Leibniz so that it suited his systematic account of alternatives, metaphysical alternatives,
in philosophy, and more specifically with respect to space, so with respect to conception of space. And in Kant's interpretation, so Leibniz defended the empirical idealism of space, while Newton defended its transcendental reality. And so to these metaphysical alternative positions, Kant opposes its own combination. It's a double position, namely the combination of transcendental idealism and empirical realism. These metaphysical options are based on the account of space. So it is because Kant does an analysis of the nature of space that he comes to defend empirical realism together with transcendental idealism. So when he says transcendental idealism, it's the doctrine that says that all the appearances are no things in themselves. The deeper ground of this claim is his analysis of the nature of space. Well, one could ask, why is it specifically space and not time? Because we are used to... I should shut up? Is that the sign you do?
No, there are flies here. But perhaps it's best if we wait, because everybody's wondering what's going on.
No, okay.
Wow.
Sorry about that.
So, yeah, okay. So let's short repeat. So these are the respective positions. I put here of space, but so what I want to stress is that following on these accounts, you have also a metaphysical position with respect to reality, and so you can also leave space, and then you see that Kant is both defending empirical realism, and then you can say of appearances in Kant's case, and transcendental idealism of appearances, whereas Leibniz, in Kant's view, so I don't think that historically that is totally correct, Kant's analysis with respect to Leibniz, but it's part of his way to do history of philosophy in a systematic way. So he frames the positions of Leibniz and Newton in such a way that he can point to different metaphysical grasps on reality. And so for Leibniz, Kant says, well, he in some way defended the empirical ideality of space, and Newton the transcendental reality of space. Don't worry, I will explain what this means. So his own double take on the nature of space, Kant's own double take, both empirically real and transcendentally ideal, is presented by Kant as the interpretive option that reconciles Newton and Leibniz, so to say, after they have died. Kant thinks that Newton and Leibniz could have agreed if they only had discovered that their conceptions of space were not covering the whole field of possible interpretations. But so this is the end of my introduction, and the question I would like to ask here is, why does Kant think that Leibniz and Newton's conceptions of space were wrong? And if you go to the next slide, well, yeah, let's say some words more on these slides. So this is quite basic. Empirical realism is opposed to transcendental realism, as empirical idealism is opposed to transcendental idealism. And if you show the next slide, please. You also see that this is not the only kind of oppositions you find. Empirical realism is also opposed to empirical idealism. And the next slide, is something that Kant particularly stresses in the third part of the first critique in Transcendental Dialectics, where he says transcendental realism is connected without people noticing that before Kant, but it automatically leads to some kind of skepticism, and this is the bridge to empirical idealism. And Kant will say, well, in the same way that empirical idealism and transcendental realism are somehow connected, or the one leads to the other, empirical realism and transcendental idealism are connected. Now, next, so the question is why, I start with Newton, why does Kant think that Newton's conception of space is wrong? And as you see in the title of the second part, Kant calls Newtonian space a non-thing, so ein Unding. So I suppose it is quite widely known that Newton conceived of space as something that is absolutely real in itself. What does that mean? Well, Newtonian space would persist, it would remain, even if there were no objects in it, and even if there were no receptive capacities to be found in the universe. So take human beings away, there would still be space in the Newtonian conception. And Kant argues that this Newtonian conception is philosophically inconsistent. Why? Because it implies that something that has nothing substantial would still exist if everything else were ceasing to be. And can I have the next slide, please? So this is a quote from the Critique of Pure Reason. If one regards space and time as properties that, as far as their possibility is concerned, must be encountered in things in themselves, and one reflects on the absurdities in which one then comes entangled, because two infinite things that are neither substances nor anything really inhering in substances must nevertheless be something existing, indeed the necessary condition of the existence of all things, which remains even if all existing things are removed. Well, if you regard space and time as such things, then Kant says one can't well blame the old Berkeley if he demotes bodies to mere illusion. And indeed, even our own existence, which would be made dependent in such a way on the self-subsisting existence of a non-entity such as time, would be transformed along with this into mere illusion. And so that we would ourselves be taken away by conceiving of time as Newton did is an absurdity, Kant says, of which no one has yet allowed himself to be guilty. So the next slide. So this is in fact the structure, if one regards the structure of this quote, if one regards space and time as Newton did, then you can't blame Berkeley, because Berkeley just follows up the consequences of this absurd conception of Newton. And in his correspondence with Clarke, Leibniz had already remarked that by conceiving of space as an absolutely real container for all outer things, one would have to think it as more substantial than ordinary substances. But then it will be transformed into something that competes directly with God. And thus, speaking of Newton and those who think like him, Leibniz writes in his third letter to Clarke, this is the... Yeah, well, I just here stress the, you see like the bold words, Newtonian space is absurd, it's a non-entity, and it leads to absurdities. So it's philosophically problematic. And then the next, so this is the quote from the correspondence between Leibniz and Clarke. Leibniz writes to Clarke, these gentlemen, so the Newtonians like Clarke, argue that space is an absolute reality, but this leads them to great difficulties, for it appears that this being must be eternal and infinite. That is why some have believed that it was God himself, or his attribute, his immensity. And so the problem is, if you conceive of space as Newton does, as an absolute reality, it would seem that this leads to its being some kind of, to being into competition with God himself. It would be almost divine. And Kant agrees with this reproach from Leibniz. The next slide is from a reflection in which Kant writes, space and time are a priori determinations of the existence of things, and they are so necessary that they should not only be transformed together with all the consequences that depend on them in the conditions of the existence of God, but because of their infinity and absolute necessity in divine properties, if they were determinations of things in themselves. Once they have been transformed into such determinations of things in themselves, there is indeed no reason why they should be limited to finite beings. And so the problem is that if you make space and time so absolute, they would condition even God's being. That's the next slide. That absolute space would have to compete with God himself is something that Clarke denies. So this is a reply that Clarke gives to Leibniz. Clarke says, space is not a being, it's not an eternal and infinite being, but it is a property. Or it could also be seen as a consequence of the existence of an infinite and eternal thing. Infinite space is immensity, but immensity is not God, and therefore infinite space is not God. So Clarke says, well, even if we consider of space as something infinite, and even if we say that it's absolutely real in the sense that Newton defends his conception of space, so that space is still there when we take everything, all objects out of the world. There's still space. This doesn't make it into something divine, because that space is infinite just means it's immense. But this is not already divinity. Now, Leibniz sees two philosophical problems in this reply. The first is Clarke's characterization of absolute space as a property. If space is a property, it must be, like all properties, the property of some substance, says Leibniz. But if one accepts the possibility of empty space, like Newton does, then there is no substance of which it could be a property. And so he says, well, Clarke, you say space is a property, but this makes no sense. But of what would it be a property? Because you say it's still there when you take everything, all objects out of the universe. And so it makes no sense to say it's a property. Therefore, if one wants to keep thinking of it as a property, Leibniz says you must accept that it has to be a divine attribute, because only God is left there when we take all objects out of the world. And indeed, as a property that is not a property of substances, it would have to be more fundamental than substances. That's why in his fourth letter to Planck, Leibniz writes, you see it already there, if space is an absolute reality, far from being a property or an accident opposed to substance, it will be more subsistent than substances. And it will be so subsistent that God could not even destroy it or change it, anything. Now, if space has to be a property but not a divine attribute, we can't conceive of it as absolute, says Leibniz. A second problem arises when one thinks of the consequences of characterizing absolute space as immensity, as Planck did in his reply to Leibniz. And Leibniz clearly is not impressed by this reply of Planck, because he sees it like some kind of smuggling the absolute space as property in his conception, without it being a divine attribute, but without clear philosophical explanation. And so Leibniz argues, can I have the next? If infinite space is immensity, then finite space will have to be characterized as the opposite of immensity. And what is that? That is the measurability. So that's an extension that has limits, is bounded. However, extension must be the affection of something that is extended. But if this space is empty, it will be an attribute without the subject, an extension of nothing extended. And that is why by turning space into a property, one automatically has to agree with my opinion, says Leibniz, following which space is an order of things and not something that is absolute. Now, Leibniz's argument is quite subtle here, because he refers to the finite, measurable spaces between substances. And if you conceive of space as Newton did, the measurable spaces between substances must be empty spaces. Now, the extension of those empty spaces between substances is not a property, because they are not substantial. And therefore, the contradiction in Newton's conception leads us directly to Leibniz's picture of space as something that is relative to substances. And so this analysis of Leibniz, so you could say that philosophically at least, Leibniz has better arguments for his own conception of space. Kant agrees with this analysis of Leibniz. The next slide, please. So that's another quote from the first critique. Kant says, "Those who assert the absolute reality of space and time," so the Newtonians, "they must themselves come into conflict with the principles of experience. For then they must assume two eternal and infinite self-subsisting non-entities, Undinge, space and time. And they exist, yet without there being anything real, so without being any objects that fill space in this space, they exist only in order to comprehend everything real within them. Moreover, the conception of space as an absolutely real property, so in Kant's framing this is transcendental realism of space, it does not only impose us to accept an Unding, but it also will lead inevitably to dogmatic idealism. And that's the next quote. Yeah, I just stress again the word non-entities, Undinge. And the next slide. Yes. So here Kant says dogmatic idealism is unavoidable if one regards space as a property that is to pertain to the things in themselves. For then, space, along with everything for which it serves as a condition, is a non-entity. So again, this unding. So let's say to take these quotes together, one could say in Kant's view, philosophically speaking, Newton's conception of space is inconsistent, and so it's unacceptable because we would have to claim that space is some kind of unding, and we don't want unding, and we don't want non-entities in our philosophical grasp of or let's say we don't want non-entities in our philosophical position. The next, so that's the next question. Why does Kant think, although he is sympathetic, as you saw, with a lot of the arguments that Leibniz addresses in favor of his own position and against Newton, why does Kant still not accept Leibniz's position of space? Well, from Kant's point of view, Leibniz's position ultimately also rests on the affirmation of a kind of absolutely real space. And so here you see that Kant thinks that somehow transcendental realism of space and empirical idealism are connected. Why is this so? Well, of course, Leibniz is nowhere saying that that space is something like a container, absolutely real container of things, which is clearly Newton's position. But for Leibniz, claiming that space is an order of things is also claiming that it is a confused representation of real relational determinations of things. And by claiming this, Kant says, Leibniz's conception can't avoid reducing the essence of empirical objects to their intellectual counterparts. For even if we grant that our conception of empirical things as spatial things is only a confused representation of those things, the fact remains that their spatiality is grounded on real determinations of things in themselves. Leibniz calls them monads, or you could say that these are intelligibilia. So these things in themselves are intelligible things, which Leibniz calls monads. But this does not change anything, because Kant takes Leibniz to say that the spatial representation of empirical things is only a confused way of representing intellectual things in themselves. And therefore, the empirical representation is nonetheless grounded in an intellectual representation. And that's why Kant says that Leibniz intellectualized space and time. For Kant, they are sensible conditions, whereas for Leibniz, they are still, they belong to the intellectual realm, and the representations we have of them are only confused. But it is not clear how this argumentation could convince a Leibnizian. By reversing Kant's argument, a Leibnizian could indeed reply that Kant does not attach enough importance to Leibniz's distinction between the intellectual realm and the empirical realm. So a Leibnizian could argue that empirical things are non-intellectual because we are only able to know them on the basis of confused representations, whereas we know the intellectual things by means of clear representations. However, in so doing, the Leibnizian would confirm Kant's point of view, since he would then admit that the distinction between things in themselves or intellectual things and empirical things on the other hand, is only a gradual distinction, namely a distinction according to the degree of clarity of representations. For Leibniz, what is given to us as appearance is not thereby less grounded on things in themselves, even if in their manifestation as sensible things, they only appear to us in a confused way. Can I have the next slide, please? So in Kant's conception of Leibniz, which, as I said before, I don't think it's very precise, so I think we have no access to other writings of Leibniz that, well, in light of which we have to modify a little bit Kant's characterization of Leibniz's position. So it's not, you could say it's not so simple as Kant makes it seem in Leibniz, but this is not really my topic for today. So I'm only concerned with the way in which Kant frames Leibniz's position. And so he says Leibniz thought of space as a certain order in the community of substances. The uniqueness and independence from things that space seems to have in itself, Leibniz ascribed this to the confusion of this concept, which made that which is a mere form of dynamical relations be taken for an intuition subsisting by itself and preceding the things themselves. Thus, space and time became the intelligible form of the connection of things and themselves. The things, however, were intelligible substances, substantiae numina, so these are the monads. Now, the fact that in Leibniz this distinction between things in themselves or monads